Nothing is here. We can hear nothing.
Teraz dačo počuť.
Okay, výborně.
Fine.
Good. So we just changed the input system. Good. So welcome everyone to today's event. We organized it at the occasion of Tolkien's Reading Day, which is a commemorative day organized throughout the whole world by fans of Tolkien on the occasion of celebrating Tolkien's work and especially what happened in his lore, in his history. There was that on 25th March, basically the Sauron and the Ring were destroyed, and that's where this, so to say, holiday comes from. So on that occasion, I initiated this our little colloquium, in which we focus on the topic of values that we can learn through Tolkien's work. The event will be divided into two sessions. The first one we have presenters. I will start myself with topic on greed. Then a presenter from Russia, Konstantin Pirosko. He will talk about the official and nonconformist understanding of values in Tolkien's work as they were perceived in the former USSR. And then an independent researcher from Italy, Giovanni Constabile, he will talk about wealth and West kindliness in Tolkien's work. Then we will have a 15-minute break, and afterwards we will have presenters, one from Poland, Lukas Neubauer from Institute of Polytechnic Institute, who will talk about the models of heroism in The Lord of the Rings, and then two guests from USA, William Fliss, who will talk about values that Tolkien's fans learn throughout the project that he organizes at his university, Marquette University in Wisconsin. And finally, Greg Boyd will come to the topic that I start with, that is avarice and greed in The Hobbit. And Craig is from St. Louis University in Missouri. Okay, so I can start with my presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. And turn on the presentation. Good. So the topic of my presentation is the destructive effects of greed in The Hobbit. What is greed? Greed is one of the cardinal vices. It's often synonymized with covetousness and avarice, and it is defined as an inordinate desire of possession. Covetousness can be understood as an umbrella term here, pertaining to any kind of possession, including the possession of others. While greed regards excessive desire of goods and wealth, and avarice regards an inordinate desire to hoard goods, particularly money. For example, the great Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas did not distinguish between these terms, and the translation of his work uses the terms as equal synonyms due to the fact that the Latin name of this vice, avaritia, literally means desire of gold. But he did distinguish three levels of meaning of covetousness. First, as denoting inordinate desire for riches, and thus it is a special sin. Secondly, as denoting inordinate desire for any temporal good, and thus it is a genus comprising all sins. And thirdly, as denoting an inclination of a corrupt nature to desire corruptible goods inordinately, and they say that in this sense, covetousness is the root of all sins. According to the genus of desire, Apostle John recognized three kinds of covetousness. Lust of the flesh, which is sexual lust, lust of the eyes, which is greed and gluttony, and pride of life. Well, the lust of flesh is the object of the 9th commandment, material covetousness is the object of the 10th commandment, and thus is very closely linked to another vice, which is envy. And those two cardinal vices therefore often go hand in hand, which can be seen also in Tolkien's work. So moving on to that. Although the vice is not much explicitly vocalized in the text, greed is the most significant vice in his novel The Hobbit. Even so much that it becomes the main motive of the story. It gains prominent place, especially in the second half of the book, from chapter 10 onwards. Nonetheless, it is evident already from the Dwarfs' famous song, which you can see on the slide, in chapter 1. And it shows that despite being bound by a sacred duty to avenge their lost kingdom, it is greed rather than revenge that is the primary motivation behind the quest. The whole song is an exaltation of different kinds of treasure and ends in the line, "to win our hearts and gold from him." where you can see with the highlighted passages, those highlighted in red color are those which pertain to the vice of greed. They deal with description of the all different kinds of treasures that are found in the mountain and that the dragon guards. And we can see that the aspect of revenge is barely implied in this song. But we'll start with the main hero of the story, Bilbo Baggins. Even the title of Bilbo's position in the story or function is a burglar suggests that it refers to some unlawful talking on somebody else's possession, no matter how rightful their claim on the treasure is. So the dwarves hire him to be their, so to say, burglar to get the treasure from the dragon for them. Moreover, they use an euphemisation of the title, expert treasure hunter, as an attempt to camouflage their relatively vicious intent. In this passage, you can see how the song from the previous slide affected the Hobbit, that it incited his own greed. That's the passage highlighted in red color. And he started dreaming about the treasures and the adventures, which appealed especially to his Tookish side of origin. That was the surname of his family on his mother's side, Tooks. And however, his Baggins side, the side of his father's family, was rather lazy and rather scared. So eventually he shudders and he very quickly realizes that this is not something which he would like to do in his life. But that doesn't help him anyway. Bilbo, as it's shown, is not wholly innocent of the vice of greed either. He is described as a well-to-do hobbit without having any credit in it because he had the luck to be born into a wealthy family, mainly on his mother's side. And being the only child, of course, he inherited all the riches. His house is described as the most luxurious, and he is particularly interested in clothing, having whole rooms devoted to clothes. This, along with his concern for such trifles as forgotten handkerchief, implies that he was quite vain. The considerable viciousness of his character is only confirmed in Tolkien's later notes, where the character of Gandalf describes Bilbo as growing rather greedy, fat, and slothful. Moreover, it is the images of the treasures from the dwarf's song that awake his prideful Tookish side and the desire for adventures. And later, when he observes the treasure for the first time, he was so enchanted and staggered by it that his heart was filled with, quote, the desire of dwarfs, unquote, to the extent that he almost completely forgot about the dragon guarding it. However, his Baggins side is not exempt from this vice either, which is exemplified especially by his close relatives, the Sacral Bagginses. They prove that greed runs in their family's veins as well. And the auction of Bilbo's house, which is at the end of the book, shows that probably all hobbits have a streak of greediness and hedonism, or at least many of those who are in Bilbo's vicinity, and not only Bilbo, the poor house owner himself. In this slide, you can see excerpts from the beginning of the book, where is the description of Bilbo's clothing, what he looks like, and also what his house looks like. So it refers to all these different kinds of rooms, especially kitchens and storage rooms and pantries, which imply his gluttony and also his greed for all this nice clothing and so on. A scholar, Jane Chance, infers that even the surnames of Bilbo's ancestral families are puns, implying their greed. Took is the past form of the verb take, and therefore it denotes stealing, while the bag in Baggins and Baggant, which is the name of Bilbo's house, can represent a money pouch or a food sack. Both are things which indicate the hobbit's inclination to bodily sins, greed, and gluttony. This is a noteworthy observation, but in my opinion also an example of overt moral interpretation. For me personally, Baggend, the name of Bilbo's house, connotes a bottom of a bag or an empty bag, and therefore it can be viewed as a metaphor of poorness, which is the exact opposite of what the Jane chants implied. In that case, it could be taken as an oxymoron or an ironic joke, or it can suggest Bilbo's later liberality, as this place was given its name only in the sequel, The Lord of the Rings, where Bilbo at the beginning of the story celebrates his 111th birthday, and on that occasion he decides to give all his possession away to his friends and family, and he keeps nothing for himself. But again, that can be just an overinterpretation, and it's better to stick with Tolkien's simple explanation that the place got its name after a real place, which was Tolkien's aunt's farm, and it is a literal translation of the French term which the French used for dead-end street, cul-de-sac, which means literally back end. However, in Bilbo's case, once his greed is woken, it all of a sudden makes him interested in the profits from the quest, and later, combined with his pride, it makes him live up to his role of a burglar by stealing a troll's purse, a golden cup from Smaug's hoard, and finally the Arkenstone, which he later trades with Bard, again quoting, "not without a shudder and a glance of longing." In each case, his action has disastrous consequences on the whole party. In the first case, to pickpocket the trolls was his fully conscious decision. In the other two cases, his actions were guided by some kind of outside force, if not against his will, then at least without his will fighting over it or even being fully aware of it. We can say that it was some kind of a compulsion, almost like a kleptomaniac's urge, or it was just the effect of the curse or enchantment that was put on the treasure while the dragon was guarding it. A similar situation was when he found the ring, which he put immediately in his pocket without thinking about it. Later on in the book, this is explained as the working of the ring's will, but since at the time when Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he had not yet conceived of the backstory of the ring. So just focusing on the analysis of The Hobbit itself, it can be viewed as a sign of Bilbo's unacknowledged compulsive greed, since usually no normal person appropriates random rings unless it is out of greed. Either way, the factor of some kind of external force or a psychological distortion which intervenes into his actions actually lessens the gravity of Bilbo's sin in both of these mentioned cases. But talking of the ring, this brings us to the character of Gollum. Bilbo's acquisition of the ring was much more innocent than Gollum's. Gollum's unnatural relationship to the thing shows his extreme greed. Gollum's love for the ring depicts greed in its most distorted form when he becomes so addicted to a material object that he does not shun committing even much more grievous sins, which goes against the traditional Christian charity, such as murder. The story of his acquisition of the ring only accentuates his greed. As Tolkien explained in one of his letters, Gollum did not only grudge the ring, trying to use his birthday as an excuse for his lust. Actually, the only reason Gollum provided to validate his claim was "because I want it." But using his birthday as a reason to get the ring implied that the birthday gift, which his friend Diego, who was the first one who found the ring, had given him previously, was insufficient for Gollum. According to another Tolkien scholar, Bassam, Gollum represents an extreme example of the isolating effects of possessiveness. This is a common feature for all the other greedy characters in this book. Gollum is therefore a self-made, socially deprived outcast who subordinates all his life to his treasure in spite of the fact that his treasure only makes him desperate and miserable. Another example of the disastrous effect of the greed-induced isolation is the master of Lake Town. In the story, he is said to only give his mind to trade, tolls, cargoes, and gold, turning his code always so as to get the best business deal in everything. At first, he does not believe that the dragon exists. He does not believe the old legends. However, he doesn't want to anger the Elven King out of the fear that his trade with the elves would suffer. And at the same time, he also thinks that the dwarves are frauds, but he still submits to the will of his people and treats the dwarves well in hopes that he would get a rich reward in case that the legends may actually come true. But when it's time for the dwarves to leave his city, he dispenses them just as eagerly because they've been quite a nuisance for him, expensive to keep, and their presence stopped most of the business in the town as people continued celebrating. So we can see that he's always focused on the material profit in every situation. Later on, when he sees the mountain lit, he designs a wonderful reconstruction of his town, especially his own residence. And though he doesn't have the resources yet, not even a promise thereof. But when the light turns out to be the dragon, the fire that the dragon creates, and it destroys the town, the master thinks only about himself, not of his people. In the end, we even learn that when the people of Lake Town were eventually given some gold from the dwarves in order to rebuild their destroyed city, the master of Lake Town stole most of it and fled into wilderness where he died alone of starvation. That's basically in the character of the master of Lake Town, the prophecy which Bard foretold of Thorin the dwarf came true. Bard basically told Thorin that he should just sit on his gold and die of starvation if he doesn't want to share. So that's what happens to the master of Lake Town eventually. Unlike Thorin, who learns his lesson at the end of the story, the master of Lake Town is not able to overcome his vice, and this results in his catastrophe, his death. However, the people of Lake Town are not too dissimilar to the master. In them, too, the greed is awakened when Thorin arrives in the city, and however, their greed is not as gruesome as their master's. Immediately when the dwarves come in, the people recall legends of their ancient town Dale and the riches that ended up in the dragon's hoard. They wish for the times to come back, and they start singing songs of victory, expecting that the mountain and the river would turn golden and cargoes of rich presents would flow down the river to the town once the dwarves reclaim the mountain. So under this impression, when they see that the mountain is lit, they first think that the legends actually came true, and it only takes Bard's warning for them to realize the truth that it's not the light of the gold and treasures, but it's the light of the dragon's fire. Luckily, their greed did not have any further consequences, and they were able to rule themselves wisely after the master left the town. So their greed is in no way punished. Nor is punished the greed of the Elven King. He also is described as, quote, having a weakness for treasure, especially for silver and white gems, and though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as a great treasure as other elf lords of old, unquote. He hoarded his treasure in his cave, all sorts of jewels and other items which the elves did not craft themselves, but they asked the dwarves to craft it for them from the precious metals, which elves traded with the dwarves for their crop produce. And here also lies the root of their hostility towards the dwarves of Thorin's clan. The elves believed that the dwarves did not give them back the crafted products which the elves ordered, while the dwarves claimed that the elves had not paid them for their work properly, and so they kept the products. Realizing what Thorin planned, the Elven King eventually decides that no treasure would come back through his forest without him having something to say in the matter. However, the reason his greed was eventually pardoned and not punished in the story can be found partially in the charity that the Elven King showed to the people of Lake Town, where basically the elves helped them rebuild their city after it was destroyed by the dragon. And also another reason can be that he was fully aware of the enchantment that was put on Smaug's treasure, and that was why he didn't want any bigger share in it. He wanted still to inspect it and see it, but only wanted to get back what was rightfully his, what the dragon had stolen from his people. Now, coming to the dragon, we can say that in the story he is an epitome of the vice of greed itself. Tolkien's scholar Caldecott claims that dragons in general are a metaphor of sin, because they are cunning deceivers inciting vices in their opponents. That's also true of Smaug, and obvious from the scene when Bilbo comes into his lair for the first time and interrogates him on all sorts of things. Yet in the mind of the wide public, usually dragons are particularly closely tied with the vice of greed, as they always hoard big treasures. And so, in the same way, Smaug is a typical Scrooge, a hoarder who has all his possession counted to the last cent, but he never makes any use of it. The gold and the treasures, they just lie there in one giant pile, as you can see in the picture, and basically rots away. However, the dragon is unable to spare even the tiniest bit of the treasure. The loss of a single item haunts him in his dreams, and when it eventually comes true, it enrages him unimaginably. He, similar to Gollum, is another addict who revenges the loss of the smallest amount of his possession on anyone who is even remotely suspected of the theft. His reckless desire for revenge is disproportionate to the harm that was inflicted to him, and it eventually leads also him to death, whereby his position of the king under the mountain is superseded by Thorin. So we finally come to the dwarfs. We can say that Bilbo and Gollum are put into some kind of a parallel in the story, as Gollum is Bilbo's doppelganger, a twin. So in a similar way, we can talk about Thorin and Smaug being doppelgangers. Of course, Smaug in the story is more, as a general metaphor of greed, is more of a literary device than a complex character. But Thorin is a complex character, and he illustrates the great personal struggle with greed. In line with the idea that people of higher social rank are more liable to vices, particularly to pride, but through it also to other vices, in Thorin, who is a prototype of his race, all the potential negative characteristics of dwarves are multiplied and most developed. He's greedy, he suffers of cowardice, vengefulness, whining, and so on. In The Hobbit, at the beginning of the story, the dwarves are described as, quote, calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money, tricky and treacherous and pretty bad, although some, like Thorin's company, are decent enough if you don't expect too much. So based on these characteristics and Tolkien's later comment on the dwarves' similarity especially the similarity of the Dwarven language and the Jewish language and their exilic lifestyle, some scholars like Brackman assumed that the dwarves were a mock image of the Jews and a proof of Tolkien's anti-Semitism. However, this opinion was disproved by another scholar, Rene Vink, who showed that Tolkien's image of dwarfs, especially in the earliest stages of his creation and his work, was inspired mainly by how the dwarves were presented in northern mythology, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and so on. And it was only an unfortunate coincidence that these stereotypes of dwarves and the dwarves in the northern mythology overlapped with the stereotypes expected of Jewish community. But what Rene Vink forgot to address was one claim of Brackmann's that even in the later stages of Tolkien's creation, when he conceived the dwarves' greed as being caused by their rings. Possibly you may know that the dwarves were given or offered rings, 7 rings by Sauron, who therefore tried to lure them into his power. And this was the way through which they were quite influenced by Sauron's vices. But we can say that even this idea that the dwarves' vices are only linked to the rings is a misconception for 3 reasons. The first reason is that the 7 rings, there were 7 rings given to the dwarves, were given only to the fathers of the dwarven clans, and therefore the previous generations in the First Age naturally could not have been affected by these rings. Therefore, susceptibility to greed was innate to their race from the moment of their creation, which was a result of their natural gift of love of precious stones and metals. Sauron only misused their natural ability and their ambition and greed, offering them the rings under the pretense that they would bring them even greater riches, but in fact he wanted to just enslave them. Unfortunately, he didn't count on their stubbornness, so it turned out to little avail for him. In spite of their latent greediness, dwarves proved extremely resistant to his power. It is true, though, that the rings did enhance their greedy characteristics to the maximum. Again, quoting from the book. The only power over them that the rings wielded was to inflame their hearts with the greed of gold and precious things, so that if they lacked them, all other good things seemed profitless, and they were filled with wrath and desire for vengeance on all who deprived them. So the dwarfs, they still needed to have some first capital, they needed gold to breed gold, in order to multiply it under the enchantment of the rings. But instead of bringing security and content to the wielders of the rings, they only brought them unsatisfiable grudge for still more and more. And this grudge, of course, led them to embark on treasure hunts, and eventually their travels, their treasure hunts, ended either in them being captured by Sauron or eaten by dragons. However, and this is the second reason why the rings were not important in the analysis of the dwarves' greed, is actually based on the analogy with Sauron's own ring. Even if the dwarves of the Second and Third Ages were considered, the dwarven rings could only affect the individuals who had the rings and people in their immediate proximity, and the rings could not extend their power to the whole race. So this implies my third reason, that neither Thorin's greed could have been caused by a ring because he didn't have one, nor he didn't even know that his father and grandfather had one before they were captured by Sauron. So Thorin's greed is only the result of his personal fault and not of any external force. And that is largely the reason, I believe, more so than the similarity between the dwarves and the Jews, why Tolkien in the later stages of his writing, even in The Lord of the Rings, attempted to rewrite the dwarvish race into a more positive image. He wanted to write the greed way, and therefore we have it dwarves who appreciate treasures and gems, but they are not greedy, such as Gimli in The Lord of the Rings. Of course, that is unless we count or take into consideration that the gold which Thorin in this story was trying to reclaim was in Smaug's possession, and therefore it was enchanted, or it was, so to say, under a curse. And that was the effect of the curse or the enchantment that affected Thorin and all his companions, including Bilbo. The sudden change in their attitude is striking. Apart from the song which we had at the beginning, the dwarves displayed greed in the first half of the book only by looting the troll's cave, where they took some swords for their defense and some pots of gold which they hid in the ground and enchanted the ground so that no one else could find it. But the nearer they were getting to the mountain, the greater was their grudge, especially Thorin's. They stubbornly kept silent when they were captured by the Elven King and interrogated by him about the purpose of their journey. So they preferred to stay stuck in the Elven prison rather than to share Smaug's treasure with the elves. And when they came to the lake town, they were pretty irritated by the people's songs that eventually they would rebuild the city with the dwarves' future gifts. And we can see it also how it affects Bilbo when he brings out the cup, and when finally the dwarves also enter Smaug's vacated lair. The dwarves become so overwhelmed by all the treasure that they find inside that they forget to be cautious. They don't consider that the dragon might come back. They don't have a care in the world at that moment. They think that they want the gold so easily, and this gives them courage. They become fierce, daring, and extremely bold. And they sing a song which is displayed here. When again, it shows how the gold and the possession of the treasure gives them courage and makes them fierce warriors. Particularly the lines, "The heart is bold that looks on gold, the dwarves no more shall suffer wrong, the king is come unto his hall." So they are very careless, they inspect the gold, they shout around, run around, and they try to take as much gold as they can while the dragon is not in sight. And when they have to go outside before the dragon returns, they look back at the treasure piles, which is said that they look back with sort of longing, a sadness. Thorin's greed culminates in his refusal to share fairly of the treasure that he found with the people of Lake Town, led by Bard, who killed the dragon, and the Elven King. Instead of like acknowledging that the people had as much right to some part of the gold for killing the dragon, he is just very selfish. He fortresses himself in the mountain, and so he isolates himself from the world, just like Smaug did before Gollum and the Master of Lake Town. So each of them at certain stage of their life isolates himself with his greed, with his gold, with the possession that they have from the rest of the world. Lust is heavy on Thorin, and he swears that no one shall take by force from his treasure while he is alive. And this threat is eventually turns true, as the treasure is fairly divided only after Thorin dies. He doesn't even mind the warnings of others, such as Gandalf or the Ravens, who warn him that his greed may lead him into death. He is accused of hiding inside like a robber, and when he's offered the Arkenstone, which is the thing that Thorin valued and desired above all, the Arkenstone is described as the heart of the mountain, but actually it's also heart of Thorin's desire. So when he's offered this gem for trade, he finally deceptively agrees to share part of his gold with the elves and with the men, However, at the same time, he's already devising a plan how not to do so and how to defeat the elves and men with the help of his cousin Dire. So we can see it in the proposal of war that he devises, but also in the way how he threatens Bilbo to kill Bilbo for taking the Arkenstone and giving it to the people. And this shows that Thorin's greed reaches its horrible peak, and in it he resembles Gollum. Indeed, all too soon did Thorin forget about his promise that he made to the the Hobbit, Bilbo, when the Hobbits saved their lives twice in the story before. And it was at that point when Thorin promised him that he would be inducted to him to the end of his life. But already, like a few chapters later, we find Thorin threatening to kill the Hobbit. So he completely forgot about his former promise. And this shows that often ingratitude is one of the vices most closely linked with the vice of greed. Another Tolkien scholar, Bailey, elaborates. He has a series of articles on Dwarven society, and there he elaborates that the essence of Thorin's failure was not in his failure of friendship or in his greed as such, but it was primarily in his failure of stewardship or his role in the world. In Tolkien's world, the love of material products, material world was not wholly vicious as long as it was used in exercise of the sub-creative power. The dwarves were supposed to use their exceptional smithing and masonry skills to make the world a more beautiful place, to protect the beauty of the mineral world, curate it, and create things for others, which was explained by Gimli in The Lord of the Rings. So the purpose of dwarves in the world is to enrich and protect the treasures that the earth itself offers us, and not to acquire it for the sake of possession. Bailey further explains in his articles that although hoarding was a great social signifier in the Dwarven society, there was always emphasis on the quality, not quantity, of the possession, and on the way how able were the dwarves to take care of their heirlooms. So similarly, in the story, Thorin's heirloom is the kingdom as such, not only the treasure that is hidden in the mountain. And therefore, his duty was to take care of the mountain as well as the people, the dwarves. The Arkenstone was but an artifact symbolizing not just the heart of the mountain as a physical center of the mountain, but also heart of the kingdom and the society as the center of the living sphere, which was in his guardianship. By exposing his people to the danger of starvation and needless war due to his greed, Thorin therefore fails his stewardship duty over his people and loses his right for kingship. So that's one of the reasons that lead to his death. He only escapes eternal and public damnation thanks to the valor that he shows in the final battle, and mainly to the repentance that he performs on his deathbed, when he realizes that people should value charity more than any kind of treasures. So, to conclude it, I would say that this only shows that in Tolkien stories, more often than not, the exercise of vices such as greed usually leads to a character's downfall, as was the case of Smaug, the master of Lake Town, and Thorin, and eventually Gollum. And their only chance of their salvation is in their repentance of their vices and exercise of virtues instead. This is exemplified by the character of Bilbo. So thank you for your attention. Okay. If there are any questions, we will have time for it at the end of the first session during the 15-minute break. And now we can move on to our second presenter, Konstantin.
Oh, well, are you waiting for me?
Hello. Can you hear me well?
Hello, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, well, can I show my presentation or not?
Yes, you can.
Well, let's. Do you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, sorry. I'll try to show it. Please excuse me. It's the first. I'll. Well, one more time. One more try. Do you see it?
Yes.
Yes. In a window.
Yes.
Well, let's start. I would say about official and non-conformist understanding of Tolkien's values in the USSR. It's the short title because I will not speak about Tolkien's own values, but the values Tolkien teaches according to the name of our event. I will talk about the perception of those values in Tolkien's books in the former USSR and their public use and misuse. First of all, I want to tell something about Tolkien's publications in the USSR. They were relatively late. Well. And I have found, based on works of some predecessors, 12 mentions, including reviews, books, articles, and so on, in the period since 1957 till 1980. Well, there are 30 from 1981 till 1986, the first 5 years of the 80s, and since 1987 till 1991, there are more than 30, and it is hard to count how many there are because there were too many in the end of the period. Well, some historical notes. In 1985, in the Soviet Union, the so-called perestroika reconstruction began, and liberalization of the foreign policy, of the internal policy began, and it led to the corruption, to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, in the end of December. But I will talk about one publication from the early 1992 because it was made in the end of 1991 to the Tolkien's anniversary in 1992 in early January. So the first full Tolkien book earlier, there were only some excerpts published in the USSR. Was The Hobbit, the first book. It was published in Russian and in Estonian in the mid-70s. Some books were translated and basically it was The Lord of the Rings and later it was Silmarillion in the late 80s. They were translated and published unofficially in the so-called samizdat using early printers and not printers but typers. And in 1982, the first volume of The Lord of the Rings, which was published under another title, not the Fellowship of the Ring, but The Keepers, Хранители in Russian, and you may know it because it was shown once in the beginning of 90s on Leningrad television as a TV show for the scene. Well, in 80s, in magazines there were published Leaf by Nigel and Smith of Wootton Major, and some translations of The Hobbit into some languages, because as you know, Soviet Union consisted of many nations now free and choosing their own way of life. Armenia, Lithuania, Ukraine, and Moldavia, now Moldova. And in 1990-1991, a lot of the rings were published. The last two volumes of the Lord of the Rings were published at last in the USSR. So let's talk about the values. In 1975, in the first Tolkien thesis in the Soviet Union, Koshelov said, "True, it should be treated orally, but only to line off what in it is born by the limited due to the social standing and bourgeois upbringing views of the other from what is organic for every human being, because the Lord of the Rings belongs to the entire world in many respects. It's humanism, its apology of struggle against evil, which clenched teeth no matter what disasters might befall any of its heroes, would no doubt find their way to the heart and mind of the Soviet reader." He wrote about the struggle of rational being against the evil part of itself. It constitutes the general meaning of the story. The Lord of the Rings.
Something, can I interrupt you for a while? I noticed that the slides are not changing, so maybe you can try to reshare.
There will no be other slides because I have no
Background, okay.
text, the exact text, so it is only a still slide to look at.
Okay, good.
Or I can look it to myself if you want.
Okay.
Switch
Now
it to myself.
see the excerpts from the newspaper, yeah.
Oh, well.
So you just have to physically click on the slides.
Do you see the slide?
Yes, now yes.
well, let's. Well, about the slide, it's two of the reviews. One from the earlier period. It was published in my native, in my city where I was born. It is called Perm. It is in the Urals. It was published in 1980 because, and it was published in newspaper for Yath, and it was published by the daughter of one of the first translators of the Lord of the Rings. He translated the Lord of the Rings for Samizdat, and his daughter published a review which was called Frodo Lives, with the subtitle Down with the War. And another example is the only review I have used from 1992, because it was from a Siberian newspaper, and we looked, we could look what is written there, the values and the hopes of that time. Well, let's return to 1970s and the first Tolkien thesis in Moscow. The Lord of the Rings is a hopeful tale. In the most terrible disasters, in battles against a seemingly invincible enemy, or sneak into the den of the Dark Lord with every opportunity to fall into his hands, its heroes preserve their hope, sometimes against hope, and this enables them to win. In The Hobbit, which was published one more time in 1976, there was a small commentary by the translator, and in it, it was written, in an entertainment fairy tale form, the author, a classic of English children's literature, reflected a very real life, the struggle between good and evil, protested against the corrupting power of money. The first talk today was also about the corrupting power of money. So if you know the Soviet ideology, the power of money was associated with capitalism and the enemies of the USSR in the world. But in the commentary, like in the first thesis, and in many other reviews and articles, the values and the book itself was shown as the good against evil. Well, the good is good, the evil is better. Let's struggle against evil, in simple words. In the review of The Hobbit, in a review of The Hobbit in 1976, it was written, kindness and honesty are sometimes stronger than any magic. In 1977, in another review, it was written, it is impossible to sit in a Hobbit hole when somewhere, even if far away, injustice reigns. It is strange that the second Tolkien's work published in the USSR was Live by an Eagle, work with strong religious and even Catholic connotations. But after The Hobbit, Live by an Eagle was published, and in the commentary in the same issue of the magazine, it was written, even an almost unfulfilled impulse to creativity turns out to be an enduring value. Even a good deed done reluctantly acquires a high moral meaning. In 1981, in a Scholar article, it was written, modern is not only the content of the novel, imbued with humanism and a call to fight against evil, but also its artistic form. In 1982, as I have said, the Chronically was published, the Fellowship of the Ring. And in the afterword by a translator, there were two translators of the volume. Muravyov, his surname was. Muravyov observed the norms of political correctness in the Soviet way. He quoted Karl Marx and explained that the goal of Tolkien's mythological series was to, in contrast to the then Nazi interpretations of the Nibelungenlied, in which they wanted to see glorification of blind and stupid devotion to the rulers, to affirm devotion to the idea of goodness, readiness for mortal risk, and self-sacrifice for the sake of one's country and one's ways of life, but by no means in the name of national narrow-mindedness, but for the triumph of cultural internationalism. Tolkien, of course, lacked a political understanding of this principle, added Muravyov at the end of the on-duty criticism from class positions. Oh, well, there is no much time for me. So, some other reviews. Tolkien's belief in the possibility of the victory of good is embodied, first of all, in the images of hobbits. Noting that critics often view Tolkien's work through the prism of Catholic concepts, the authors of the monograph, it's the monograph of Rogers, 1980, emphasize the universal significance of the moral problems posed by Tolkien. Not only in Russian articles were published, but in some other languages, such as in Tartu. Lauri Linask from Tartu State University. Tolkien identifies the effects of fantasy with religious experience, yet as a Roman Catholic, he is surprisingly heretical when he says that the Gospels contain a fairy story or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. His quotes from the Tolkien's on fairy stories. This statement is not far from the widespread viewpoint which identifies the Gospels with a kind of fantasy that has mythicized some memorable events in the past. Although theoretically Tolkien has defined his eucatastrophe as a manifestation of some religious feeling, it is consolation. His literary work offers rather encouragement than consolation. His protagonists encourage the readers to fight evil and give them a hope of victory. They do not find any solace in submission to evil, nor can they consequently offer it to others. Their slogan is stand up and fight, never turn the other cheek. Well, in Young Pioneers magazine, Pioneer, in 1984, it was written, reading this fairy tale, we learn not only to rejoice at the storyteller's merry invention, but also to understand, albeit on a fabulous example, the laws of history, learning to love history. And in 1989, there were very different historical situation. Many previously forbidden books and films were published and shown, such as Star Wars, some Solzhenitsyn's political works, some novels such as Lolita by Nabokov, and in 1989, Muravyov, the same Muravyov who quoted from Karl Marx in 1982, he wrote without any trace of a class approach that The Lord of the Rings is a book about the nature of power that wants to be power over a person. immoral and enslaving power based on lies and violence. Spiritual capitulation before such a power and any participation in it corrupts and destroys a person. The general moral laws of the existence of mankind are immutable. Human dignity is the main asset of a person, and it must be defended to the end at any cost, in any circumstances. The myths of creation, on which Tolkien worked almost the most, and which in the final posthumous edition of the Silmarillion still looks rather pathetic. It is enough to know that this is an attempt at figurative comprehension and so to speak, plot interpretation of the first chapter of the biblical book of Genesis. There is nothing surprising here, because Middle Earth is in the beginning and in the end our world. We only know that Tolkien's understanding is much more orthodox than it might seem at first glance. And in a review from 1989, it was said, why didn't the Lord of the Rings was published in the Soviet Union before? If it were published a generation before, our world would be more green and more merry, so to speak. Well, and the reviewer said that probably the censorship was afraid that the readers would see in the Black Country, in Mordor and Sauron, our own country in the times of 1930s, 1940s, in the times of Stalin, in the times of mass repressions. So we can see the evolution from some Soviet and class approach to the humanist approach, which was always in the understanding of officially published reviews. I have known many times about unofficial. Interesting enough, one of the translators I have quoted, Muravyev, was also one of the first readers of the Lord of the Rings in the early 1970s. Let's go to nonconformist understanding. There were two parts of opposition. They had to live a double life, an official life in Soviet country and unofficial meeting, which were prohibited, where they talk about religion, where they talk about the politics. They were Christians. Some of them tend to be Catholic. Some of them were Orthodox Christians, and there were discussions among them about the Lord of the Rings and the values of the book. One point was the way of Sam. Another point was the way of Aragorn. The way of Aragorn, I've already said, good against evil. Let's fight against the evil Soviet government. We are the prisoners. We have to prepare the rebellion of the prisoners suppressed by the Soviet government, by the communist government, the way of Aragorn. Another part of those that group understood the Lord of the Rings more in the way of Sam, that the evil could not be defeated by the evil. You have to believe in God. You have to wait for the chance. You have to hope for the better, and like hobbits, you have to deal with your burden in such circumstances, which they saw that they were in the Soviet Union worse than of the hobbits traveling to the fiery mountain. So if there are questions, you can ask me. I'll try to shorten the last part, the last section of my talk.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. As I said, we can have questions after at the end of this first session. So I would invite Giovanni to present his work, and after his presentations, we can have, so to say, a break, but at the same time a question session.
Hi. So I'm trying to share my screen.
Yeah, we can see it. Good.
Okay.
Yes. Fine.
Good afternoon. I'm Giovanni Costabile from Italy, and I'm going to talk to you about truth and gas kindliness in Tolkien's works. And I appended a quote by Tolkien to the title of my talk, with Eleanor and Fredil about their feet. Starting with truth, want us to take into account the threat, the main threat to truth as a marital truth or a betrothal, which is adultery. While there is no specific study on Tolkien and adultery, I'm going to endeavor to present on the topic, because I do not agree with Basni when he says that there are no women or marriage in Tolkien's works, with hardly any exception. I'm going to challenge his view. And I'm going to start from Aragorn and Arwen's troth, when they pledged their vows in Lothlorien, and their choice, but especially her choice, Arwen's choice, was made and her doom appointed. Tolkien uses this word, doom, which is not the same as fate, but implies negative understanding of her fate, which is due to the fact that she renounces the elven immortality to join the fate of man. But there's more to it. Their troth is plighted upon the till they looked west to the shadow and west to the twilight, and they plighted their troth and were glad. There are two elements that I would like to underline, which are the shadow and the twilight. Arwen says, "Dark is the shadow, and yet my heart rejoices." And also Aragorn says that he renounces to the shadow, but he also renounces the twilight. Because while the shadow must be opposed, the twilight, which is elven immortality, must be renounced in order for the union to be possible. This is what the doom that was mentioned is about. And so when Elrond, Arwen's father, learns about their choice, and especially Arwen's choice, his heart was grieved and found the doom long feared none the easier to endure. And he says to Aragorn, a shadow lies between us. Again, a shadow, as you see. And he says that he fears that to Arwen the doom of man may seem hard at the ending. So we keep seeing these words, the same words returning, shadow, doom. And again, this was previously, before their troth, Elrond already had told Aragorn that a great doom, in this case, awaited him, because he should neither have wife nor bind any woman in troth until his time came and he was found worthy of it. And he also says, your own eyes have betrayed you, meaning that he's believing that Arwen could reciprocate him was wrong in Elrond's opinion, when instead we know that Elrond was wrong in this case. And again, at the end of the passage, we find that in case Elrond was wrong, because he was aware, after all, that he might be wrong, but if he were wrong, he said that in that case, doom would be laid on them. And I'm going to look at the sources that Tolkien probably had in this idea of the betrayal through the eyes. In Middle English, we have a guide for anchorites, a manual for anchorites that is called Ancrene Riule, and Tolkien wrote the preface to Mary Salu's translation. And in this work, we find stated, of Eve, our first mother, it is recorded at the very beginning of her sin, its entry was through her eyes. And again, later, well, there is also the mention of David's eyes when they were caught by the sight of Bethsabee. And in this case, adultery comes into place. But also later, St. Augustine is cited, an unchaste eye is the messenger of an unchaste heart, says Augustine. And this is important because when we have to consider the threats of adultery to troth, there are three steps in this scene, which are defined as suggestion, which is the one that takes place through the eyes. Then there is delight, when one takes pleasure in considering the idea of an union. And then there is consent, when it actually becomes a deed. But in Augustine's mind, this was not just what happened in adultery. This was what happened in any sin. It was later, let's skip John the Scot. It was later, John the Scot repeats the same account by Augustine, but it was in Andreas Capellanus' De Amore, where the same account was repeated but referred to love instead than sin. Because Andreas Capellanus wrote, love is a certain inborn suffering, passio in Latin, derived from the sight of an excessive meditation upon the beauty of the opposite sex, which causes each one to wish above all things the embraces of the other, and by common desire to carry out all of those precepts in the other's embrace. And this definition is precisely the same in the same three steps or stages that Augustine had used to define sin. This is not to mean that Andreas meant love to be a sin, but the subject has been much discussed, because when it comes to have its place in discussions of adultery, the matter may be intricated. Anyway, returning to Aragorn and Arwen, we find the same three stages, because we have sight or suggestion when Aragorn is enchanted upon seeing Arwen. He saw a maiden, thinking that he has strayed into a dream. Excessive meditation is what follows. In the days that followed, Aragorn fell silent, and his mother perceived that some strange thing had befallen him. And then there is passion, albeit implicit, when they decide to be together, when for a season they wander together in the glades of Lothlorien until it was time for him to depart. This is before their actual pledge to each other. And in Tolkien's Tale of Beren and Luthien, one finds precisely the same three steps that are sight, excessive meditation, and passion, because first we have Beren coming upon Luthien, and he fell into an enchantment. And then there is suggestion, because he became dumb as one that is bound under a spell, seeking for her. And Tolkien describes the light of excessive meditation in these terms. He strayed long in the woods, wild and wary as a beast, meaning that he was entirely caught in the thought of her, and he didn't mind even his own well-being. And eventually there is consent and passion as the two lovers kiss, when Beren caught and kissed the elfin maid in the Lay of Leithian. At this point, I would like to take into account the fact that Aragorn actually, well, we are not informed about the whole story of Aragorn and is having to endure years of separation from Arwen to wait before their marriage could actually take place. We don't know the whole story, but certainly we know that he was tempted by the idea of having a relationship with Eowyn, even if this is implicit and he refuses her. But when he talks about how he could not reciprocate her, it is evident, I argue, that at least he, since he was so sorry of refusing her, he might at least have considered despairing of being able to be together with Arwen to actually consent to her request. And anyway, he says eventually to her that what she, well, to Eomer actually, that what she loved in him was only a shadow and a thought, which echoes what in Middle English was phantom and dream. It was a common expression in Middle English text, which is found to mean an illusion. And it is found in the Gawain poet as phantom and fairy, and also in other works, but we should only take it as a parallel here. And this indicates that Tolkien believed the troth between lovers to be as binding as actual marriage, as it used to be in earlier times. And also another thing that is underlined here is that unrequited love is more sorrowful than death itself, as Aragorn says that sorrow and pity were always present to him, even as he rode on the paths of the dead. And no fear upon that way was so present as the fear for what might befall her. So it is evident that there is an affection for her. then one might stress the fact that he refuses her, or might stress the fact that he might actually have been tempted not to do so. And even Tolkien hints at the temptation of Galadriel as far as adultery is mentioned, because when he was interviewed by Danny Garul in 1965, Danny Garul, the interviewer, said that there should have been some digression from the order of marriage in The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien replied, surely there's no lack of interest. Wouldn't you have thought that Galadriel, every character is tempted at some point? But actually what we find in the books is only that she saw the same vision as Frodo of the Eye of Sauron in the mirror of Galadriel. And anyway, to this temptation, she says the door is closed. Coming to guest kindliness, the subject is related, and I will only treat it as it relates to the present matter. Love is usually pictured as a guest entering the window of the male soul who acts as the host, and so woman is a man's guest. But instead it is precisely the opposite, and it is the opposite in Tolkien, I argue, because both Beren and Aragorn are guests in Elven realms, either Doriath or Lothlorien, when they fall in love with Luthien and Arwen, respectively. And so I think that we have the role of the hostess instead, that is removed by Tolkien for a precise reason, to secure the divergence of his fantasy from Augustinian adultery of the art, meaning that the three stages represented sin instead of only actual adultery. And this is as a parallel in Tolkien's depiction of fantasy in his essay on fairy story, because in the same way, if reality is hosted by a fantasy in the way that Tolkien defines as inner consistency of the secondary world, then any change subsequently introduced in the laws governing the secondary world may involve this belief, unless the change is justified within the secondary world itself. And in this way, it is not the human mind that is entered by a fantasy, but the human mind that may enter a fantasy. Or as Tolkien himself put it, new form is made, fairy begins, and man becomes a sub-creator. The children of man, writes Mark Ederton, are literally the guests enjoying the guest kindliness of the people at the other world, meaning the elves. And this parallels Genesis, when it is said that a man shall leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Or in The Lord of the Rings, Aragorn took the hand of Arwen and Domiel, and they were wedded in the city of the kings. Thanks for your attention, and Gellatan Iremais Amar.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. For my students who are in the classroom, you can go. We'll see each other next week. There will be another group of students who will come in 15 minutes. And for the people who are joined online, it's a time for you to maybe ask questions now if you have any. Okay, so a little quiet here. If there are no questions, we have the 15-minute break, and then we will back with our other 3 presentations then. Yes, also thank you very much for everybody who was able to join and who was willing to present. I'm sorry for the little delay at the beginning as we were trying to figure the technology out, which may be due to that fact Konstantin didn't have as much time for his presentation as we would want, but I think it works out pretty well so far.
To all the presenters, great job, guys. It was really fun to listen to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. As for the question of Ben Sorensen, if I understand it correctly, Tolkien, in his letter 153 to Peter Hastings, wrote that, well, there is a secondary world in his writings, and in this world there are elves and so on, and there is a primary world, and he didn't took one for another.
That's an incredible observation, and I've been through some of the archives at Wheaton to see what he was corresponding with C.S. Lewis, not for any in-depth research, but just for fun. And Constantine, I saw a lot of what you were saying somewhat confirmed in his correspondences, as well as other people's recollections of his correspondences and his conversations walking with C.S. Lewis. It was fascinating to see you confirm it also in your research.
I have to add about my research that it is interesting that there is a very small amount is written about Tolkien ecological beliefs and things, ecological themes in his writings in the Soviet times. There are much more written about his religious and philosophical ethic conceptions that about his calls to protect nature and so on. Before I started my research, I would think otherwise, that ecological theme is safe for totalitarian regimes, relatively safe, but I have found the opposite.
There's always Patrick Harris defending Middle Earth and his other works. Patrick Harris, I'll write it in the... If it can help.
I also want to thank Martina and Giovanni for the much more scholar research and much more philosophical approach.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we can start the second section of our little colloquium. The first presenter is Łukasz Neuballer from Politechnika Wrocławska in Poland. So, Łukasz, you can prepare yourself for the presentation.
Right, hello everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Yes. Well, I'm afraid I don't have a presentation, so we just have to look at me all the time, unfortunately. But I would like to start with a quotation from the book of Proverbs. The human heart is haughty until destruction comes. Before there can be glory, there must be humility. So, my paper deals with the different depictions of heroism in the works of Tolkien, and there's in particular one of my favorite ones, what you can see in the final chapter of The Fellowship of the Ring, when things get really rough and there's this intriguing verbal duel between Frodo and Boromir. It's kind of like representing two different models of heroism. So of all the dramatic passages in The Lord of the Rings, this ultimate breaking of the fellowship after the foot of Aemon Hen, I think is one of the most captivating and consequence-laden episodes in the struggle to destroy the One Ring, between the departure, the Fellowship's departure from Rivendell on the 25th of December and the fall of the Dark Lord on the 25th of March. Now, having lost Gandalf, the unwritten leader in the minds of Moria, or so they initially led to believe, Frodo and his companions are evidently come to a decisive impasse, whence they could only be taken by some providential interference. At first sight, the sudden assault of the Uruk-hai does not really look like any act of the divine force. In fact, may easily seem to many a first-time reader of The Lord of the Rings that the world-saving mission is bound to suffer a fatal blow. However, it is usually in such moments of greatest tension and dramatic intensity that Tolkien tends to pose some of his most essential and thought-provoking questions. Questions whose nucleus is almost invariably embedded in the complex, but at the same time highly consistent world of ethical considerations. Now, when the members of the Fellowship reached the green lawns of Parth Galen, some like 10 days after they're leaving behind the relative safety of Lothlorien, they gradually become aware of the fact that this is the very point of their quest when they can go, that's a quotation, they can go no further without choice between the East Way and the West. That is, whether they should make for the soon-to-be besieged city of Minas Tirith, or whether they should take the more perilous path and walk straight into the proverbial jaws of death, of hell, sorry, not death, which is here epitomized by the realm of the enemy, by Mordor. Now, the actual ground of their choice lies chiefly in two fundamentally incongruous visions of the conflict. The alternatives being either an open confrontation with the aid of what some erroneously consider to be the only weapon that could help them overcome the growing might of the Dark Lord, or a clandestine intrusion into the land of Mordor with the intention of destroying the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom. Now, the actual essence of this divergence is to be found in the two conflicting and, most importantly, culturally determined attitudes affecting the characters' perception and evaluation of the idea of war. For the sake of conceptual simplicity, we may call the former ancient heathen Germanic, and the latter modern Christian sacrificial. And as these correspond to the two not quite compatible, though sometimes surprisingly interconnected worlds, the first of which Tolkien was clearly, though not uncritically, devoted to as a scholar, the other as a pious and morally committed Catholic. When it comes to the breaking of the Fellowship, these two incompatible, so as not to say conflicting attitudes, are, I think, best exemplified by the characters of Boromir and Frodo. In fact, the dramatic confrontation seems to bear some of the most fundamental and mind-challenging marks of Platonic dialogues, in which the participants are typically seen discussing some philosophical issues and problems and arguments by means of heuristic and dialectal reasoning. I think it's also not impossible that the two figures, the man and the hobbit, in reality correspond to the two conflicting sides of Tolkien's inner dialogue, much as those exemplified by the voices of Tidwald and Tordhelm in The Homecoming of Bernhoth, or the artist Nigel and his neighbor Parish in Leave by Nigel. Here, the more emotional and at times less rational side of human nature is reflected in the impulsive character of Boromir, the High Warden of the White Tower, where a sensible and above all self-controlled one finds its literary outlet in Frodo, yes, the much more composed ring-bearer. Now, Tolkien's fascination with somewhat reckless, overconfident, and vainglorious, but in due course heroic characters of chiefly Germanic origin is beyond any doubt. Numerous distinguishing traits, physical as behavioral, which might be identified in the likes of Beowulf, Birknoth, Roland, Kullervo, I think came to be ingeniously reproduced in some of his most successful creations, such complex figures as Thorin, Turin, and Boromir. I think it also should be stressed that, however, that neither of them was ever meant to be portrayed as an exemplary villain, with nothing but a kind of a superiority complex and insatiable thirst for power. It's more probable that, regardless of the narrative significance, they were actually thought of as some sort of ethical templates against which the attitudes as well as conduct of other characters could be weighed. Now, with his proud demeanor and large-scale ambitions for the waning greatness of the once great and prosperous realm of Gondor, Boromir makes a very good example of Tolkien's creative reinvention of the up till then fairly standardized image of the archetypal early medieval hero, Celtic, Germanic, or other. Now, he's not only grand of stature, but as befits the eldest son of an heir of the Steward of Gondor, he's depicted as a man with regal-like manners, quote, a fair and noble face, dark-haired and grey-eyed, proud and stern of glance, end of quote. Notwithstanding his indisputable patriotism and admiration for his truthful and hard-working countrymen, Boromir is certainly not free from the enticements of what ancient Greeks refer to as hubris, particularly in the sense of his unrelentless lack of humility and overestimation of capabilities. What is more, it may sometimes appear that his primary motivation is not merely the safety and well-being of his nation, but perhaps also, perhaps just as importantly, the military reputation that he's likely to enjoy as a result of his deeds on the field of battle. It is then precisely on account of his martial exploits that Boromir goes down in history as a man of exemplary courage and disregard for his own personal safety. In a determined, though ultimately ineffective, effort to save the hobbits, Pippin and Merry, from being captured by the overwhelming numbers of Saruman's orcs. His heroic death in combat may not even be an indirect result of Boromir's own choosing, as is certainly the case with the overconfident likes of Birknoth or Roland. However, it does provide a very good illustration of one whose death is brought about not so much by the valor of his opponents, but by the overwhelming number, thus further boosting the already remarkable portrait of Boromir, of Denethor's eldest son. Just as much grounded in the ancient tradition of early Germanic history and legend is the moving passage which depicts Boromir's funeral in the first chapter of the Two Towers. When the hero's body is ceremoniously placed in the boats that subsequently bears him many miles from where the assault actually took place, it is hard not to think of the opening passages of Beowulf, where the legendary king Skjöld is put into a ship and literally given to the sea. Now, almost diametrically different from Boromir is the character of Frodo, this seemingly insignificant halfling from a distant land of the Shire, whose unimposing physique and overall attitude to military confrontations would not make him a likely candidate for an early medieval role model. It is, however, the little hobbit who in the long run becomes the actual hero of the novel, and not just in the sense of a protagonist, one who actually focalizes the numerous virtues and graces of a world savior. Strange as it would doubtlessly have seemed to the early medieval audiences, the bulk of Frodo's success as a post-medieval hero probably lies in the relatively humble ancestry. Unlike Boromir, who's in a straight line a descendant of Húrin of Emen-Anen, the original Steward of Gondor, Bilbo's younger cousin and adoptive heir is an orphan. He is the son of Drogo Baggins and Prunella Brandybuck, yes, the couple of curious and very un-Hobbit-like inhabitants of Buckland, who actually happened to die in rather embarrassing, though never sufficiently explained circumstances while boating on the river Brandywine. Now, despite being adopted and practically brought up by the richest and so one of the most distinguished hobbits of the Shire, Frodo appears to have retained much of his natural modesty and selfless consideration for at first the small community that he lives in, and ultimately the peoples of Middle-earth. There is absolutely no arrogance or any other major attitudinal defect in him. In fact, he seems to humbly, though understandably not quite eagerly, accept the responsibility for destroying the ring in the fires of Mount Doom. Frodo's initial conviction that he should complete his quest on his own is not dictated by the hubristic wish to surpass anyone in valor and endurance, but by the practically Christ-like conviction that he should not put his great burden on anyone else's shoulders. And in the end, however, unlike the heroes of Beowulf or the Song of Roland, he agrees to share the many perils of his quest with the faithful companion Sam, whose enormous contribution he never forgets to accentuate in connection with the eventual success of his mission. Now, another vital ingredient in this heroic, or rather unheroic, depiction of Frodo is that, unlike the vast majority of great Germanic warriors who populate the world of early medieval literature, he does not throw his life away in the erroneous belief that this sub-created reality of Middle-earth, his death in combat could form the basis of his, say, posthumous pedestal. In fact, unlike Beowulf, Birknoth, or Roland, he and Sam are ultimately rescued in the catastrophic finale of the War of the Ring, which prevents them from partaking the dubious delights of immediate poetic afterlife, the most desired, perhaps even compulsory, rite of passage for early medieval heroes. In addition, the numerous wounds, physical as well as psychological, and in particular, periodic and increasing declines in Frodo's overall medical condition, do not help in building up the conventional heroic image of, quote, nine-fingered Frodo and the Ring of Doom that some tries to visualize as a somewhat wished-for complement to the famous tale of Bear in one hand and the Great Jewel. Now, it is hard to escape the impression that to the early medieval audiences, this worn-out halfling would probably not constitute, or probably would constitute, a rather pitiful sight and not much of a valuable material for the central or even supporting character of some heroic lay or epic. Now, standing face to face on the slopes of Aim in Hand, Boromir and Frodo thus emerge as two divergent or even conflicting, though at times actually nicely complementing, sides of Tolkien's revised idea of the heroic ideal. This long-established Germanic conception of a high-born warrior who gloriously dies in battle, and the new model hero of implied Christian provenance, who does not shrink the responsibility of his secretive, and thus, of course, less spectacular mission. It is, of course, not the first and certainly not the last time that Tolkien focuses attention on the issues of heroism, courage, and sacrifice. Numerous texts of literary as well as academic nature that one would find today filed under his name seem to tackle these themes with varying degree of seriousness or intent. Nowhere, however, is this confrontation of the two heroic models as intense and as clear-cut in its ethical manifestations as in the ultimate chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring. Now, onto Boromir. Possessed by a fleeting but intense lust for the ring, Boromir suddenly confronts Frodo in an attempt to discourage him from, quote, walking blindly into Mordor and offering the enemy every chance of recapturing the ring for himself, end of quote. He may be but temporarily overwhelmed with the devastating power of Isildur's Bane, but it is primarily this inherent heroic defect of his character that, magnified by the enormous influence of the ring, gives vent to the sudden eruption of his long simmering craving for the control of the war. Boromir's failure to realize the futility of his action is caused by the inability to see his own limitations, and the fact that the conflict may be resolved in the manner he's not quite used to. His intentions are, for the most part, noble, but the power of the ring happens to increase in proportion to the might of the person that happens to be in its possession. It is in fact the same, quote, defect of character molded by aristocratic tradition that Tolkien identifies in Birknoth, the heroic but perhaps unnecessarily magnanimous Ealdorman in the Battle of Maldon. It is therefore, Tolkien says, a noble error, and the error of a noble, a tragic fallacy in judgment that constitutes one of the most fundamental ingredients in the Aristotelian concept of the tragic hero that he developed in the 13th chapter of the Poetics. Now, the desperate fury which arises in Boromir as a result of Frodo's refusal makes it even more dangerous. Not used to being told what to do or what not to do, Boromir literally tries to clutch at every available straw, sometimes using clever rhetorical tricks, such as, where there are so many, all speech becomes a debate without end, but two together may perhaps find wisdom. Or sometimes he's literally threatening and insulting Frodo, quoting from the book. How it angers me, fool, obstinate fool. So all this is done in order to either get into the possession of the ring or at least make the Hobbit join forces with him in order to save Minas Tirith. Now, seen in this context, they're much more level-headed, though not entirely free from the ring's influence. Frodo appears to be the very antithesis of Boromir, at least a traditional early medieval concept of an initiative-taking hero. As has been observed, his realization of the heroic virtues rests on the entirely different set of moral axiomata, which evidently stem from Tolkien's own experience of the First and Second World Wars. The first, of course, as a soldier, and the second as a worried father. And most importantly, his Catholic upbringing and faith. So to begin with, it does not even have to be military motivated, as maintained by K.V. Troll. Genuine heroism may actually evince itself in a great number of virtues, for virtues are as such independent. Now, the basis of Frodo's conduct is therefore his firm, if of course only subtly implied, adherence to the core principles of the Christian faith, such as, might say, the seven heavenly virtues of Aurelius Clemens Prudentius. So these are chastity, charity, diligence, humility, kindness, patience, and temperance. Now, this dramatic emergence of an entirely new, or one could add perhaps post-medieval hero, may seem somewhat peculiar in a book which not only draws on so extensively on a range of medieval themes and tropes, but also uses medieval-like templates to create its own social, cultural context. Well, it must be stressed that in modern criticism, the semantic content of the word medieval may be very broad, and so, quoting from Werner Fligger's book, like so many words we take for granted, it can mean different things to different people. Now, to some, the term Middle Ages is synonymous with the often used, but to a large extent erroneous expression saeculum obscurum. Others may think of it, perhaps more correctly, as an age of great intellectual and technological advancement. Furthermore, one's conception of the period would doubtlessly have to depend on his or her own life experience, as well as cultivation of various ethical and aesthetic values that are determined both by the times and the culture in which one happens to have been raised. Tolkien's Middle-earth is, of course, for the most part, inspired by the cultural heritage of the Middle Ages. Some evident sources, Beowulf, the Battle of Maldon, the Volsunga saga, have been identified and examined, sometimes in great detail and interpretive reach, in countless books and individual papers published over the past few decades. There is no doubt today that the analogies which exist between Tolkien's literary output and these inspirational models are far more than just the topical borrowings that one can easily notice at first glance. In fact, their nature is often pregnant with multiple associations and resonance of thematic, structural, stylistic, and purely philological nature, as is plainly the case with Boromir, appearing to have been modeled mainly on the characters of Birchnoth and Roland. So characters exhibiting excessive pride, courage, dramatic effort to sound the horn, like in the Song of Roland, yes, and of course heroic death. So also Boromir's name, yes, the fact that is never beside the point in the case of Tolkien's literary imagination, to some extent also reflects his pugnacious character, whether you look at it as a Sindarin name. I think there's means bright jewel, and also if you think of it as a kind of a Slavic name and what it may actually mean. Now, Boromir's attitudinal antithesis in this dramatic verbal confrontation that the captain of Gondor initiates on the slopes of Amenhen is of an almost entirely different mold. Despite the fact that his name is of unmistakably Old Germanic origin, the ring bearer, Frodo, as Frothy, that means wise, the ring bearer is perhaps as far removed from the ethos of early medieval literature as is the race of hobbits. He's, of course, ovidly medieval, with his mithril chainmail hidden under the cloak and the short elvish blades by his side. And what's more, he lives in the chiefly pre-industrial age, which, notwithstanding the few evident but rather insignificant anachronisms, looks very much like the European Middle Ages. It is nonetheless difficult not to see the circumstances of Frodo's quest in a slightly different light than that of the early medieval literary tradition. The theme of a difficult journey towards the long sought-for goal and also regularly appears as a common plot device in pre-medieval lore. However, the usual complex and difficult moral choices he's expected to make along the way only, I think, remotely correspond to the somewhat fairly standardized and ethically superficial tests and trials which I found in various narratives of ancient and medieval provenance. In fact, the various difficulties and challenges which Frodo comes across in his quest, physical and mental, they all call for the forms of selfless sacrifice in the service of a common cause that most of traditional heroes would probably have found partly or even completely unworthy of the hyper-masculine consideration. As I've observed, in contrast with Boromir, the ring-bearer's conception of a military confrontation appears to have been shaped more by the modern awareness of the evils of warfare than by the heroic ideal of early Germanic poetry or literature, perhaps in general, even in its later hallowed form. Now, Frodo evidently has more features of a contemporary Christian, who only goes to war because there is apparently no other way of saving the world. Moreover, from very early on in the novel, that is, at least since the sudden assault of the Nazgul on the summit of Weathertop, he appears to epitomize some of the usual inner fears and anxieties found in the shell-shocked soldiers of the Great War, which, as may be imagined, Tolkien knew very well from his personal experience, his personal observation. Now, these two constituents of Frodo's battered self, the Christian-like piety with a very strong sense of moral responsibility on the one hand, and the post-combat-like feeling of despondency and exhaustion on the other hand, are not normally found in the more traditional depictions of ancient and medieval heroes. Although there are certain instances where the combination may be observed, it does not normally occur prior to the often poignant and thought-provoking death scene of the hero in the Battle of Mordor, Beowulf, or the Song of Roland. Yet even then, their ultimate prayers and confessions, as we see in the Battle of Mordor and the Song of Roland, appear to be brought about primarily by the dramatic circumstances that they find themselves in, not their habitual manner of conduct. It is, in other words, not the hero's habitual modus operandi, but a somewhat forced, if obviously sincere, acknowledgement of their hitherto hitherto sins and wrongdoings. It will be incorrect to assume that a hobbit's attitude and bearing on nothing but perfection and holiness, even in comparison with Boromir's proud and often arrogant conduct. Now, the narrative thread in which he appears, so that is in books 4 and 6 mainly, may reveal certain roughly detectable analogies to the Gospel's treatment of Christ's sacrifice and even resurrection. But there is no direct or even indirect correspondence between the character of Bilbo Baggins and the biblical depiction of the Messiah. He's a flesh and blood mortal, even if not quite a man in the strict sense of the word, who only gradually attains the enlightenment during and as a result of his quest to destroy the One Ring, falling and rising, much as many saints of ancient medieval latter times, as he struggles to reach the literal and figurative summit of Mount Doom. In contrast with Boromir, his heroism is therefore not so much of military, but principally ethical nature, and the victory which comes with the ultimate destruction of Isildur's Bane, the Ring, is less of a glorious triumph that brought to the fore the new model hero, Frodo of the Nine Fingers. But the long, arduous, and much wished-for victory of the forces of good over the forces of evil, in which the Hobbit obviously plays no small part. Notwithstanding his evident moral downfalls and dilemmas, Frodo's opponent does not automatically fail all the expectations placed on his broad shoulders by the people of Gondor and by his 8 companions. Indeed, the Boromir, the proud Gondorian, fails neither in his outward role as an early medieval-like warrior, nor as an honest and above all self-reflective hero of the not quite Christian provenance. Indeed, he has a strong moral character and principles. Seen in this light, Boromir's verbal confrontation with Frodo should not be interpreted as an unambiguous epitome of the conflict between good and evil. Instead, as has been observed, the two characters, or rather two moral attitudes they bring into focus, are more likely to stand for the two conflicting sides of Tolkien's inner dialogue, or even, in the more global sense, two culturally determined systems in which codified are the markers of their respective ethical standards. Standards which, regardless of their actual derivations, so pagan or Christian, do not always have to be mutually exclusive, and at times may even be traveling the same route, but not necessarily on the very same lane. Now, published several centuries after the composition of the Battle of Mordor and the Song of Roland, The Lord of the Rings provides a very good illustration of the evolving perspectives on the notion of heroism. And despite its medieval-like setting and employment of numerous themes and tropes, whose roots lie in the cultural context of the Middle Ages, Tolkien's novel, in fact, revolves chiefly around a fairly modern mid-20th century model of aesthetic sensibility, one which does not deny the necessity of a military confrontation, but at the same time remains wary of the many evils of warfare, physical as well as psychological, affecting both individuals and entire communities. Now to conclusions. Tolkien's reinterpretation of the concept of heroism should not, I think, be understood as its complete and radical redefinition. Despite his sometimes marked criticism, as in The Homecoming of Bergmoth, he never openly condemns the great heroes of the past or purports the needs for replacement of the ancient heathen Germanic model with a more modern Christian sacrificial one. After all, seen in the light of the doctrine of just war, military confrontation does not have to be a contradiction of the modern Christian-inspired notions of a chiefly non-violent resistance and conflict prevention. In fact, it may sometimes be the only means of opposing the aggressor, provided that this confrontation be undertaken solely with the intention of bringing about peace. And that, regardless of the circumstances and one's emotional state, the ethical standards of warfare be always properly adhered to. As I observed earlier, Tolkien's vivid portrayal of the verbal confrontation between Boromir and Frodo is not an isolated case of his exploration into the realm of heroic measures of early medieval literature. There are indeed numerous instances of his more or less explicit attempts to examine this fascinating issue, from the more academic-like analysis of Bergnoth's Offermod in the second short essay that accompanies the homecoming of Bergnoth, to the less formal ones in his literary works, including The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And the first of these works, of course, I'm referring to Thorin, and in The Lord of the Rings, it's the character of Boromir. There could be no doubt that the dramatic war of words that ensues on the slopes of Amenhem constitutes perhaps the single most recognizable instance of Tolkien's in-depth examination of the evolving concept of heroism, whereby the conventional, if somewhat idealized and often self-important pursuit of post-mortem honor and glory is for the most part replaced by the more modest call for self-denial and sacrifice. Whether the two models be instantly recognized as respectively ancient heathen Germanic and modern Christian sacrificial is obviously a matter of one's perceptivity and interpretive framework. Nonetheless, given the enormous depth and breadth of Tolkien's academic knowledge and spiritual convictions, as well as his first-hand experience of the horrors of the Great War, this allotment of heroic dilemmas in the characters of Boromir and Frodo appears to be a very close rendering of his own ethical considerations in the coherently developed world of The Lord of the Rings. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Just as we had it in a previous session, the questions will be left for the end of the session after the presentations, or if you have something, you can write it in the chat. So now we will move to our second presenter, which is William Floss from Marquette University in Wisconsin.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm grateful to Martina Jurichkova for inviting me to be part of this colloquium and for suggesting that I share insights from a collection I'm building here at Marquette University. I've never opened a PowerPoint on Google Meet before. Let me see what happens here. Let's see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So I am the Tolkien archivist at Marquette University, which is in the city of Milwaukee in the state of Wisconsin in the United States of America. If you've never heard of Milwaukee, I'm certain you've heard of Chicago. We are 90 miles north of Chicago. Why does Marquette University have a Tolkien archivist? It stems from the fact that we own the original manuscripts for 4 of Tolkien's fictional works: The Hobbit, Farmer Giles of Ham, Mr. Bliss, and most importantly, The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's magnum opus. When I say that we have the manuscripts for these works, what I mean is that Marquette owns most of the paper materials Tolkien produced in writing these books. The collection contains over 11,000 pages. The largest body of manuscripts, unsurprisingly, is from The Lord of the Rings. We have plot notes, early sketches of chapters, handwritten drafts of chapters, typewritten drafts of chapters, typewritten drafts of chapters with handwritten corrections. Tolkien was a fanatical reviser. The galley sheets, almost everything from the initial concept to the point of publication is here at Marquette. Christopher Tolkien consulted Marquette's collection when he wrote 5 of the volumes in the History of Middle-earth series, specifically volumes 6 through 8 and the first halves of volume 9 and volume 12. These are the volumes where Christopher explains the history of the writing of The Lord of the Rings. He could not have written those books without Marquette's assistance. Marquette University purchased these manuscripts directly from Professor Tolkien in 1957. So Marquette has been home to Tolkien's manuscripts for over 65 years. The only other place with more Tolkien manuscripts is the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. Marquette University's library has become a research center for people studying J.R.R. Tolkien. My job as Tolkien archivist, and being Tolkien archivist is just one of the many things I do here at Marquette, my job as Tolkien archivist is to help people in their research. After acquiring these manuscripts, Marquette began collecting secondary works on Tolkien, books, articles, theses, dissertations. The university also began documenting the fandom that rose around Tolkien. The early fandom is captured nicely in the fan magazines, or fanzines as they were commonly called. These were self-published periodicals that circulated among Tolkien fans beginning in the late 1950s. Fans would contribute content to the zines and, in a pre-internet age, communicate with each other through the fanzines. Collecting these fanzines launched Marquette on the path of documenting historical Tolkien fandom. A few years ago, I began looking for a new way to archive contemporary fandom, and so I developed the Tolkien Fandom Oral History Collection, a digital collection hosted on Marquette's library website. This is what I will be talking about today. My project really boils down to a single question for Tolkien fans. If you had just 3 minutes to talk about J.R.R. Tolkien, what would you say? Each fan has an open microphone to provide a brief, up to 3-minute testimonial. I record the interviews either in person or via Zoom. Most of the interviews are in English, but fans are welcome to contribute in their native language if they prefer. I can find people to translate them for me. For example, Martina Juričková has graciously offered to translate any Slovak interviews for me. To provide structure, I ask everyone to keep 3 questions in mind while speaking. When did you first encounter the works of Tolkien? Why are you a fan? What has Tolkien meant to you? The 3 minutes is entirely their own to share what they wish, guided by the 3 basic questions. Having only 3 minutes to talk about Tolkien forces fans to concentrate on what's most important to them. Before I use this collection to speak to the theme of the colloquium, let me share my broader vision for it. As this project took shape, 2 important questions confronted me. The first was, how many interviews should I gather? I found my answer in The Lord of the Rings. One of my favorite poems is the Song of Theoden's Ride that appears in the chapter titled The Muster of Rohan. An excerpt from this Song of Rohan tells us, "Forth rode Theoden, 5 nights and days, east and onward rode the Erlingas, through fold and fenmarch and the Firian wood, 6,000 spears to Sunlanding, Munberg the mighty under Mindalwin, Sea King's city in the South Kingdom, foe beleaguered, fire encircled." That became my goal, 6,000 interviews. My idea is to find 1 fan for each rider of Rohan in Theoden's host. The second question I faced was, do I wait until all 6,000 interviews are completed before sharing the collection? Again, I found my answer in Tolkien, in The Lord of the Rings. When the host of the Rohirrim, riding in darkness, approached the Pelennor fields that stretched before Minas Tirith, the Rohirrim encounter the Ramas, an outer wall defense built by Gondor. The forces of the Dark Lord Sauron have breached this wall in places in their push towards the city. For the riders of Rohan, the Ramas is a problem. It acts like a bottleneck for the Rohirrim that seek to ride their horses onto the Pelennor fields. Faced with this bottleneck that slows the advance, King Theoden makes a decision. "Eomer, my son, you lead the first Eored," said Theoden, and it shall go behind the king's banner in the center. "Elfhelm, lead your company to the right when we pass the wall, and Grimbold shall lead his towards the left. Let the other companies follow these 3 that lead as they have chance. Strike wherever the enemy gathers. Other plans we cannot make, for we know not yet how things stand upon the field. Forth now, and fear no darkness." Taking inspiration from Theoden as he faced the bottleneck of the Ramas, I decided to group the oral histories into aoreds, or companies of 120 interviews, and then let these companies join the greater host as they have chance. My method with this collection has been to create a transcript in English for each interview. Excuse me. For each interview, I edit each audio recording to make it flow more smoothly. Once I have 120 recordings ready, I publish the new aored of interviews in Marquette's digital collection, available through the archive's website. Visitors to the digital collection are welcome to listen to the individual recordings as if they were mini podcasts, or if they prefer, they can read a PDF transcript of each interview. The interview transcripts are keyword searchable, which means you can search across all the interviews in the collection for specific words or names. In addition to listening to the actual recordings or reading the transcripts, visitors can visit Marquette's institutional repository and download a data set containing the full text of all the interviews, along with variables describing each interview: age, gender, fan location. I update the data set after each new aored is mustered. Here I am providing the collection in the form of data for digital humanists to mine for insights about the reception of Tolkien's works. The data set has been downloaded 758 times so far. I leave it to the scholarly community to publish about the fandom from the collection. I see my job as archivist being to build it. I do not know of any publications yet based on the data, but I expect they are coming. I've collected 1,124 interviews so far. Of these, 840, or 7 aoreds worth of interviews, are available online. The remainder are still being processed. The average age of the fans interviewed has been 40.5 years. The youngest fan so far is 8 years old. The oldest fan is 87 years old. As for gender, the breakdown is 52% identifying as male, 46% as female, and 2% choosing non-binary as their gender. Having an almost even split between male and female is a valuable aspect to this data set. Not many data sets provide such a good opportunity for comparison. I must admit that this almost even division between male and female fans has surprised me, because when I was growing up, Tolkien's works had the reputation as boys' books. Tolkien was regarded primarily as a writer for males. I was happy, very happy, to have this collection here correct my misperception. In terms of geographic or national origin, I have collected interviews so far from people living in 42 countries and 2 territories. The territories are Bermuda and Puerto Rico. It is an impressive list. However, most fans have been from the United States, 81% of the total. So the title of my talk could be modified to read more accurately: what values do Tolkien fans learn primarily in the United States? I have collected interviews from 49 of the 50 United States. Arkansas is the only state in the Union not represented in the project. I know of one fan who grew up in Arkansas, but he has not lived there for many decades, and he chose not to list this place as his home. The remainder of my time today, I will use this collection to speak to the topic of the colloquium. The central question at the heart of this colloquium is, what values does Tolkien teach? I will set aside the question of whether Tolkien consciously sought to teach any values in his writing. It is debatable. But it is certain that people do consciously learn values from Tolkien. Here I am taking this question of what values does Tolkien teach and turning it around to ask, what values do Tolkien fans learn from Tolkien? Does Marquette's Tolkien Fandom Oral History collection provide an answer, or the beginnings of an answer? Well, over the past couple weeks, I studied the 840 interviews that are currently available online, looking for examples in which people either state outright or imply clearly that Tolkien has been a teacher of values to them, values that they try to follow in their own lives. Such testimony usually appears in response to the third of my guiding questions. What has Tolkien meant to you? I have concluded that of the 840 interviews currently available in the digital collection, about 20% of fans described Tolkien as a teacher of values who guides them in living their life. In other words, 1 out of every 5 fans felt that the idea of Tolkien as a teacher of values was important enough to them to spend part of their 3 minutes talking about it. About 1/5 of these responses were general statements to that effect, without much specificity about what they actually learned. For example, one person said, quote, "I lost my father at a young age, and these books kind of became my father. They were really instructive in my teenage, formative years." Another fan shared that, quote, "The moral backbone of Tolkien's work sort of formed my entire moral and philosophical view on the world. It shaped everything about my viewpoint as a child, and I think it is still important as an adult." A third fan said, "Tolkien has meant a great deal to me as a virtual mentor. His books provided guidance and leadership my youth completely lacked. I let the light of Eärendil's Silmaril guide me in how I view and interact with challenging people and circumstances." Now, these are vague assertions, but fortunately, there are many other instances where people articulated which values they have learned from Tolkien. I have compiled a top 10 list of the values that Tolkien fans learn, ranked in frequency from least to most expressed. These are only the top 10. I encountered many others. Maybe some of the values on this list will surprise you, but I expect most will not. Before I share the list, let me say as a caveat that analyzing these interviews is a very subjective exercise. I think that anyone who publishes scholarship based on this collection must be very explicit in describing their methodology, and they must share their data analysis. They must share details on how they categorized and coded the interviews. My treatment today is quick and dirty. I will start at number 10 and build toward the number 1 value that fans learn from Tolkien. I call number 10 Hobbit Virtues. And this is a constellation of values built around the idea of the simple life. Tolkien's hobbits have taught these fans to enjoy the simple things in life, such as good food and cheer, home and family. About 6% of the fans referenced this specifically. Number 9 value learned by fans is an appreciation of the natural world. They have learned to better appreciate the primary world of nature through their appreciation of the natural beauty of the secondary world, Arda, and specifically Middle-earth. I have described the number 8 value as compassion/mercy/pity, terms that the fans seem to use interchangeably. The pity shown toward Gollum, especially, has served as an instructional example, encouraging these fans to strive to be merciful toward others in their own lives. The 7th shared value is love, or 7th stated value is love. For these fans, Tolkien has taught them the importance of love and encouraged the readers to deepen the various loves in their lives. The 6th value is loyalty and perseverance, which I have grouped together because I think they are expressing the same sentiment here. This has meant remaining true in relationships to others or to a cause, and never giving up in the face of obstacles. 5th value is courage. These fans have learned to be more courageous in their own lives through appreciation of the courage exhibited by so many of the characters in Tolkien's stories. I have described the 4th value as even the smallest person can make a difference. Many fans in the interviews are troubled by today's world. They wonder what they can do in the face of such enormous problems. Tolkien, and his hobbits in particular, teach them that even a seemingly insignificant person can make a difference in the world. In the books, this is probably best expressed by Elrond at the council, when he says, "This is the hour of the Shire folk, when they arise from their quiet fields to shake the towers and councils of the great." For the third most popular value, I grouped similar sentiments together under the label "fighting the good fight." Tolkien's works are filled with moral struggle, and not surprisingly, they teach fans the importance of struggling for the good and not being passive in the face of evil. Fighting the good fight means fighting for things worth fighting for. It means doing the right thing in whatever situation you find yourself, even if there is no hope for success or reward. Fighting the good fight includes the idea that evil can only be defeated if good is vigilant and forceful. When expressing this value, some fans introduce a melancholy aspect to it, invoking Galadriel's expression of fighting the long defeat. Number 2 value is friendship. Tolkien's works have taught fans the importance of friendship, the value of friendship, the necessity of friendship. The relationships between Tolkien's characters, especially in The Lord of the Rings, among the hobbits, and within the Fellowship itself, are seen as good examples of how to establish and maintain friendships. I find it interesting that in some cases, Tolkien's immediate influence here blurs with that of the fandom. What I mean is that some fans have learned the importance of friendship, the value of friendship, through their participation in the fandom, by meeting people through fan groups and establishing strong bonds with them. You could say that all of this emanates ultimately from J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, for the number 1 value. Have you guessed it yet? It is hope. Hope, 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 and the importance of not losing hope. Most of all, Tolkien's stories have taught fans never to lose hope. It has taught them to cling to hope, even in the darkest moments. These fans recognize that despair is the weapon of the enemy. It is the essence of the Nazgul. One fan uses as her mantra, "Day shall come again," Hurin's battle cry at Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the battle of unnumbered tears from the Silmarillion. As another fan put it succinctly, "One of the biggest things I've taken away from reading Tolkien's works is his message of hope. I find it truly comforting." So there we have it, the top 10 values Tolkien fans seem to learn from his works. As this collection grows, I hope somebody will explore the idea further and in a more sophisticated manner than I have here. In closing, I would encourage anyone who is interested in contributing to the Tolkien Fandom Oral History collection to visit my scheduling page to reserve a time slot to meet with me on Zoom. I will be in Germany in early June collecting interviews at Tolkien Tage, so if any of you are planning to attend that, please stop by and say hello. My goal for this project is 6,000 interviews. I realize in hindsight that I chose that number with my heart and not with my head, because it will take me years to get there. So if you meet anyone in the future who you think might like to do this, please tell them about it and encourage them to participate. Thank you for listening to me today. Although I do not resemble Theoden in any conceivable sense, I leave you with his words, "Forth now, and fear no darkness." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation and the amazing work that you do at the university. Okay, we'll have time for questions later. And now to our final presenter, Craig Boyd from St. Louis University in Missouri. He will come back to the topic that I started today's session with, greed and avarice in The Hobbit. Okay, Craig's here, so you can prepare your presentation or your talk.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Great. I do not have a PowerPoint, so I will walk through this if that's okay.
Yes.
I am trying to navigate my technology here, and as an older person, it's not always easy for me to do that. And I am also recovering from COVID right now, so if I have a bit of brain fog, I apologize for that. So please be patient. A couple of items to begin. I should say that I am a philosopher and my area is moral philosophy. So I am primarily working in the area of virtue ethics, and what interests me, especially in Tolkien, is the idea of exemplars of moral virtue and moral vice. And as Dr. Fliss had talked about in terms of hope as kind of that value, my very first published essay on Tolkien was on hope in Leaf by Niggle. So I'm particularly interested in that particular virtue. And I think for me, the meta narrative in terms of Lord of the Rings is that tension between hope and despair. So the next essay I'm working on is on Denethor and despair. The Middle English term is wanhope, which is used a couple of times throughout his work. But a couple of other things here. What I'm going to talk about here is something I've been working on with my daughter, who has advanced degrees in theology and literature, the literature degree from Marquette University. So this is something that she and I have worked on together in terms of how to go about considering this issue, the various issues of vices. And this one, in terms of Thorin, has to do with avarice, and I take a Thomistic approach to this. And Tolkien, in what is now a somewhat controversial paragraph in one of his letters, describes the various races of Middle-earth and their various vices. He attributed sloth to hobbits, pride to the elves, treachery and power lust to wizards, folly and wickedness to men, grudge and greed to the dwarves. 2 points here as I proceed. First, this last comment about the various races and their fatal vices has led to charges of anti-Semitism in Tolkien's work, as some claim he uses anti-Semitic tropes in his depictions of the dwarves. But that likely, for me, distracts from the more interesting question, in my view, of how there are often good and wicked exemplars among all of these races. And it is the exemplarity that I find most interesting. Although Tolkien resisted the idea of allegories being present or prevalent in his work, he admitted that there was plenty of what he called applicability and exemplarity. Now, the second point is that evil happens in isolation. Sauron, Denethor, Gollum, Saruman, all of them are isolated individuals. And this is also what we see with Thorin. Whether the isolation is physical, like Saruman in the high tower of Orthanc, or Gollum in the Misty Mountains, or whether it is psychological, like Boromir in the Fellowship or Thorin in the Company. Evil demands to have people, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer observed, by themselves. With that said, I think it's possible to examine the similarities between Tolkien's account of greed and an analysis of this capital vice in the work of Aquinas. Now, avarice is considered one of the capital vices. There are, of course, 7 of these capital vices. Pride or superbia sometimes is an uber vice, but you have vanity, and you have envy, and avarice, which corrupt kind of the higher elements of the soul in Aquinas. And for Aquinas, avarice is in general defined as kind of an immoderate internal desire or a delight or a love of money and wealth, or the things that wealth can buy. He says in the Summa Theologiae, quote, "A person's good concerning external goods consists in a certain measure and according to a certain measure to have external riches insofar as they are necessary to live in keeping with the condition of one's life. Therefore, it will be a sin for him to exceed this measure by wishing to acquire or keep them immoderately. This is what is meant by avarice, which is defined as a kind of immoderate love of possession." Now, it's important here to note that there is sin and there is vice. So a sin is any kind of act that is immoral in terms of transgressing God's commands or transgressing virtue or what prudence or charity would prescribe. But a vice is an internal habit, a fairly consistent habit a person possesses, in contrast to virtues, which are consistent good habits. And so of these 7 capital vices, they're better called capital vices rather than deadly sins, because vice emphasizes this notion of it is a fairly stable characteristic. But a capital vice is one that is a source or an origin that has offspring vices. And so with avarice, there can be a kind of avarice of acquisition and avarice of attachment. And both of these kinds of avarice have their own offspring as well. And this is one of the things that leads Aquinas to call a kind of insensibility to mercy or compassion. So acquisition in thought leads to a kind of restlessness, and acquisition in action leads to violence, deceit, fraud, and treachery. And it is for these reasons it is a deadly vice or a capital vice. And it is so deadly not only because it leads to various kinds of sinful actions, but because it stands in opposition to the virtues of justice and liberality. Now, justice, as most people know, is the virtue in which each person gives to others what is their due. And avarice opposes this because avarice takes more than what is one's own due. It is a kind of excess in terms of this is mine, and I will refuse you what you truly deserve because I want what's mine. But it also opposes liberality, which refers to the freeing of one's sense of possession to give to others. And it's not really generosity or charity, although it's similar. It is better understood kind of as a mean between avarice and prodigality. It's kind of a sense of I'm not going to, be too possessive, but I'm also not going to be too prodigal in terms of being wasteful. So when Aquinas says that a person's love of things begins to outweigh their inclination towards charity, then avarice becomes kind of a mortal vice or a mortal sin. And here there are interesting hints of Augustine's distinction between use and enjoyment. And if you're familiar with that, you'll know that Augustine says enjoyment is how we engage persons and use is how we engage things. And the problem is for most people that they use persons and they enjoy things, whereas they should be enjoying persons and using things. And so you can see this in the Hobbit, especially in terms of a couple of characters. So you can see this in terms of the Master of Lake Town as opposed to Bard the Bowman. So the Master of Lake Town, once he is introduced, he welcomes the dwarves, but he only supports them because he thinks it's to his own advantage in terms of material gain. And so after Smaug destroys the town, he blames the dwarves for the situation. And he reminds the people of the treasure that the dwarves should have rewarded them with, and, should have, yeah, and we have given the dwarves aid, he says. And by the end of the book, um, the master of Lake Town has a kind of karmic ending for his wicked behavior. He starves alone in the wilderness after trying to flee with stolen gold. And in stealing the gold, the master is doing an injustice to the people of Lake Town. And it should have been done for the common good. It should have been done for everyone's good, not just for his own selfish, acquisition. In contrast, Bar the Bowman is the kind of the epitome of virtuous justice. He is described as a stern fellow, and he never takes anything that is more than his due, and he makes sure that everyone gets what they need. And after killing the dragon, he goes to Thorin with the men of Lake Town and with the elves with a request for rebuilding the town. And he wants to claim a portion of the dragon's hoard that was also taken from his ancestors. So this is a sense of justice because, after all, it was the dwarves and Bilbo who provoked the destruction of Lake Town. So this is actually a form of a kind of compensatory justice. And so he wants no more than what the people of Lake Town are due, and he wants no less. And he doesn't want it for himself, but he's interested in the common good of the city, for everyone who is part of the city, and their city has been destroyed. So he stands in a kind of opposition to the master of Lake Town. And then we get to Thorin Oakenshield. And it is Thorin's avarice that it stands in opposition to justice and liberality. And of course, this is this issue of avarice is one of the capital vices that is what Aquinas calls a vice opposed to justice. So justice is about giving people what they are owed, and avarice is about failing to give people what they are owed in the interests of what one wants for oneself. But it's interesting that Thorin is portrayed, as this dwarf who really kind of stands outside of the rest of the company of Thorin and company. And the rest of the dwarves tend to invite Bilbo into community with them, but Thorin feels as if he is above that. And so there is a kind of looking down upon everyone else. And this is a kind of arrogance, which is also tied to the vice of avarice, because only he knows what should be done. And, Tolkien in the Silmarillion talks about the creation of the dwarves, and he alludes to kind of their materialistic tendencies. And he says, quote, they will love first the things that are made by their own hands. And this is Eru Iluvatar. And so understanding that the dwarves have this kind of tendency towards acquisition and towards gold and the things of the earth, Thorin kind of provides an exemplar in this respect. But the exemplarity of Thorin is such that it's kind of a negative exemplar for what avarice does to a soul. Now, Alison Milbank refers to both Augustine and Aquinas in her work, Chesterton and Tolkien, as theologians. And she talks about what it means for a person to be evil. You must, first of all, be good or possess a good that has been corrupted. And this seems to permeate what's going on throughout all of the Lord of the Rings. And so Thorin has the goodness of the created order in terms of he is a person, he wants justice, but that sense of justice also turns to a sense of revenge, which deteriorates into a kind of avarice that is really kind of, if you will, completely destructive of his character. And what that results in is that he becomes a stranger to his his own family and his friends. And so when you see Bilbo reading Thorin, even through all the horrible things that Thorin does to Bilbo, Bilbo still sees Thorin as a valuable and noble person, capable of heroism, if you will, in that kind of medieval Germanic sense of heroism. And so there is this conflict between Thorin's heroism and his avarice. But it is his avarice that corrupts his sense of justice and liberality, and it even corrupts his sense of being charitable to Bilbo, who has saved them on a number of occasions, throughout the narrative. So what we see then is that in this entire process, Thorin values the treasure not as a means to an end, not as an instrumental good, not for use, as Augustine would say, but Thorin values the Arkenstone, this greatest of all treasures of the dwarves. He sees that as valuable in and of itself, and so he places the value of the Arkenstone above the value of his friendship with Bilbo and his family and his friends in the entire, for the entire quest. And so he mistakes, if you will, an instrumental good for a good in and of itself. And so Thorin's desire to reclaim, the Arkenstone and the treasure is what leads to his own destruction and, to the chaos that ensues. And we can see this early on in the very beginning of The Hobbit, when they are singing "For over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, we must away ere break of day to seek the pale enchanted gold." And of course, as many of you know, this notion of the term pale also can be understood in terms of the pale rider, death itself. So this notion of pale is significant in terms of understanding, kind of the deathly sense of gold itself. So we see that it is, the Arkenstone itself is described like a globe with 1,000 facets. It's shown like silver in the firelight, like water in the sun, now like under the stars, like rain upon the moon. And quote, even Bilbo was not immune to the appeal of the Arkenstone. But when he comes across it, he becomes tempted to claim it as his share of the treasure. And it is Thorin's perverse obsession with the Arkenstone and his excessive attachment to the treasure that ultimately makes him opposed to the demands of both justice and liberality. So when Bard and the people of Laketown come begging for aid and their just recompense, Thorin's heart is hardened, and it has made him disinclined towards mercy and charity. And Tolkien says, quote, "Long hours in the past days he had spent in the treasury, and the lust of it was heavy on him. Though he had hunted chiefly for the Arkenstone, yet he had an eye for many another wonderful thing that was lying there." End quote. And when Bilbo sees this injustice done to the people of Laketown because of Thorin's greed, he takes it upon himself to rectify the situation, demonstrating the virtue of liberality, but also of prudence or practical wisdom. Bilbo can actually see the true relationships that exist between people and things, and he's able to do the right thing. And so Bilbo's solution both exposes Thorin's avarice while simultaneously saving the rest of the company from Thorin's judgment. Taking the Arkenstone and giving it to Bard and the Elven King as a means to parley with Thorin, Bilbo prevents the army of elves and the men of Laketown from attacking Thorin and his company. And he makes sure that Bard and the people of Laketown get their just compensation. By detaching himself from the tantalizing beauty and magnetism of the Arkenstone, Bilbo proves that he is liberated from immoderate attachment. And thus he has a sense of, the virtue of liberality in opposition to Thorin's avarice. Now, this becomes more apparent when Thorin discovers that Bilbo gave Bard the Arkenstone, and he shakes Bilbo. He picks him up and throws him, wants to throw him to the rocks below, and he just has horrific curses that he pronounces upon Bilbo. And what's interesting is that Thorin here has so completely isolated himself from his friends and his family that even his dwarves, quote, felt shame and pity, end quote, when Thorin banishes Bilbo from the company. The consequences of Thorin's avarice and his attachment to the treasure is truly destructive, and is because of his immoderate attachment to the treasure and his reluctance to part with any of it that the Battle of the Five Armies ensues, claiming the lives of many, including his own and his own kindred. Now, this promotes violence and bloodshed and all these things that Aquinas attributes to avarice, as I've listed earlier. The conclusion of the battle, Thorin, as you all know, is mortally wounded from the fighting, and he manages to speak to Bilbo before he ultimately passes away. He says to the Hobbit, quote, "Since I leave now all gold and silver and go where it is of little worth, I wish to part in friendship from you and would take back my words and deeds at the gates," end quote. Thorin sees that the price of his avarice costs him his relationship with Bilbo and wishes to amend it, realizing that relationships with others are more precious than material goods that have no moral value. And he concludes his farewell to Bilbo by saying, quote, "There is more in you of good than you know, child of the kindly West. Some courage and some wisdom blended in measure. If more of us valued food and cheer and song above hoarded gold, it would be a merrier world. But sad or merry, I must leave it now. Farewell," end quote. Before he departed the world, Thorin recognized the damage that his greed did, and even more importantly, came to understand the real treasure in life was friendship with others and cultivating loving and charitable relationships with those. After Thorin dies, Bilbo, quote, "wept until his eyes turned red and his voice was hoarse," end quote, signifying his sense of reconciled friendship and grief. Like Boromir in Lord of the Rings, Thorin is reconciled to the Fellowship in a kind of deathbed redemption. The genuine good, the common good, the bonum commune, can only be attained in community and by a community. Thorin's excessive desire and sense of acquisition harms others and himself. It is only by a participation in a community that one can achieve the good. And oddly enough, the Latin term Aquinas uses for participatio is often translated into English as fellowship, which gives rise to further thoughts about Tolkien, Aquinas, and the nature of the good that we share in community. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. And now we can have finally time for questions. So anybody who has some questions for any of our three presenters, now it's your time, you can ask. Yeah, Ben?
I do apologize. I somewhat usurped this question and answer time. I actually had a question for Craig. In all of your research and all of your thinking of these virtue ethics surrounding Tolkien, did you find that it was more Aquinas or more Aristotelian, Nicomachean, if you will, in his outlook? Does he ever speak of any type of moderation to find virtue as a lacking or a excess of a certain characteristic?
Well, I would say that let me give you a little bit of background. Tolkien had Father Xavier's copy of the Summa Theologiae, so we know that he knew Aquinas. Right now, I'm working on revising and correcting my earlier work. I'm not so sure that Tolkien was really a Thomist, as a number of people, including myself, have argued, but more kind of a generic Catholic in terms of the tradition of Augustine and Bonaventure and Aquinas. So there is kind of this generic soil, if you will, that Tolkien writes out of. I don't think he is so much of an Aristotelian in the sense of how he would consider things. And one of the earlier presentations by Professor Neubauer, I think, gets at this in a helpful way. Tolkien, I think, would not see Aristotle's magnanimity as a virtue. It is kind of this arrogant, self-possessed individual. Boromir actually represents kind of the Aristotelian definition of magnanimity, where Aristotle describes that person as reluctant to acknowledge favors done to them and more quick to acknowledge favors done to others, if you will. So I have an earlier essay titled Nolo Heroizari, The Humble Journey of Master Samwise. And in that essay, I argue that Sam, according to Tolkien himself in one of the letters, says that Sam is the true hero because Sam is humble. And this is a virtue that Aristotle would not acknowledge as a virtue. He would see it as a weakness. So I do not see Tolkien as being Aristotelian as much as I see him being kind of generically Catholic and emphasizing two virtues. Hope and humility are the two virtues that, in my reading of Tolkien, are the two central virtues that enable the fellowship to succeed. So that's how I go with that.
If I may add to it, I think Tolkien never really acknowledged in any of his letters or any of his materials the philosophical, theoretical, or theological sources that inspired him. So I would say that it's like a combination of different sources, and primarily the oratory where he basically was, so to say, raised in, and Father Francis Morgan, who became his adoptive father.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, Konstantin?
Oh, well, I have a question for Lukasz. I have said that among non-conformist Tolkienites in the 1970s in the USSR, there were two groups. One of them turned to the way of Sam, the other one to the way of Aragorn. Are those groups similar to what you've said? The way of living a life in difficult circumstances, or even heroism.
Thank you. Yes, I remember my first reading of The Lord of the Rings. I was like 9 or 10 at the time, with playing with some group of friends, more or less my age, and everyone was thinking of it was like kind of pretending to be some of the members of the Fellowship of the Ring, and for some reason I wanted to be Sam. To me, he kind of appeared to be the most heroic of them all. Heroic and then at the same time humble, just like Frodo in a sense, in that verbal confrontation that I've been talking about. But it keeps on changing. one of the characters that I think I tend to identify with at the moment and for many years is Boromir. Not because I'm big and strong, not because my wish is to die in combat, but he somehow epitomizes, these numerous human vices that are in everyone, and it's a beautiful thing what happens to him in the first chapter of the Two Towers, where he essentially confesses his sins to Aragorn, who acts, so to speak, in persona Christi, as a person hearing the confession. So this is something I've been working on for some time. And as to your question, or rather a comment, I think it was, yes, right. So I understand that there were groups of people that identified with either one or the other character, right? Am I right to?
Well, it is most of the values, the theme of our meeting. One group thought that we must fight with the evil, and the other one thought that we have to be more Christian, more pitiful, more merciful and not to fight to avoid making more evil.
Yeah, I see. Well, definitely being Christian does not mean that you have to refuse to fight. There's this concept of just war that basically states that, well, if there's a need for some military confrontation, then you just have to do it, yes, to prevent worse evil that might happen. So yes, of course, the different ways of looking at heroism and the way in which you should fight evil, and I think that Sam and Aragorn definitely are kind of models, maybe not as different from one, they're not as different from one another as Frodo and Boromir in that episode that I looked at in my talk. But yeah, I think that's just very important to be able to acknowledge that there are different ways of fighting evil, and of course there's a need to adjust the means and other things to the situation. So yeah, sort of hope it answers your question. Well, it wasn't really a question, yes, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a question from one of our students here. You can come here so that they can see you.
Hi, I would just quickly like to ask Mr. Flick, if you were to join the 6,000 spears on a more subjective note, what would your contribution be?
I'm actually saving number 6,000 for myself, assuming I live long enough. So I think I'm starting to frame it in my mind. I think mine will be kind of a reflection on my role here at Marquette and how it's changed me. Certainly, I may speak in some way to some of the values that I've gained. Now, one of the interesting things that fans say about The Lord of the Rings is that as they read it throughout their lives, every time they encounter the book, it's a new experience. They get something new from it. They see something that they didn't see before. So in a way, it's very hard for me to predict what I'm actually going to say, because my thoughts may have changed by that point. So I feel like I've deflected your question away and not really answered it, but that's the honest truth.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm not sure if anyone else wants to have a question. If not, maybe I just have some final comments, especially for Craig's presentation, that I think you elaborated or you explained the philosophical and theological contents behind the analysis of the story and behind the Greek and things related. very nicely and kind of complemented what I was talking about at the beginning of this event. So that's just one thing that I wanted to mention. And also, I'm very curious about the picture that is behind you. Is that a hobbit smoking behind you? Because at first I thought it's like an Orthodox icon with a golden color, but then I saw that it has a pipe.
Yes, that is actually an icon that was written for me by a Buddhist monk while I was in Minnesota working on my essay on Gollum and envy. And he wrote that for me as Sam Gamgee as a saint. So the top thing there is the top piece is the Book of Kells. You can't see it entirely, but there's Saint George and the Dragon, an icon there, and then the other one is Sam Gamgee smoking a pipe, maybe Saint Sam Gamgee. And for me, Sam is the key character. And if you read the letters, and I know you have, Sam is someone who Tolkien just loves to talk about. And so for me, Sam is the medieval notion of everyman, and I love that. So yes, that's what that is.
That's lovely. Okay, so
Joanne, we can't hear you. Giovanni, you are speaking, we can't hear you.
I was thinking that Aragorn could take pity on Gollum when they hunt for Gollum, and eventually he and Gandalf find Gollum, but they just interrogate him. So it's not underlined by Gandalf, but they too and the elves took pity on Gollum. Just a note.
Well, if I am not mistaken, mainly characters were merciful for Gollum. Bilbo, Gandalf, Aragorn, Frodo, and even Sam in the last stage, if I'm not mistaken.
It takes place behind the scenes, so it's not something. It's only told, recounted by Gandalf, the hunt for Gollum that he and Aragorn undertook in order to find him. And when they found him, he eventually fled, and but they managed to interrogate him before he escaped. And when they did, they just wanted to seek information from him. They didn't harm him in any way. So even though they suspected that he might have done a lot of evil, actually, they didn't harm him in any way, just took him captive. And of course, one might also say that the way of the fighter is not archetypically the way of Sam, but he does fight the orcs in the tower at Kiritungol.
Yes, I agree with you. Thank you.
Okay, so if there's no more questions, I once again want to thank all our participants today that they were willing to join in this event and talk for our students at the university. And I hope that in the future we may organize something similar sometimes again. Okay, so thank you very much and goodbye all.